A couple of months ago, I think it was, I was in a Bible study, and I was asked to lead the study. And the topic I was asked to study was why it's important to have a loving marriage. I've told you before that I've chosen to stop counseling people in their marriages, but I am willing to study marriage with people, and they work out, and I can kind of help them figure out how these things apply to them. And in the study, the way I chose to teach it was I found in the scriptures 4 things reasons that were important to have a loving marriage. The first one is it glorifies God. There were several passages that went along with that, but that was the main focus of the first topic. The second reason was that it's good for your spouse to have a loving marriage because it benefits them. The third reason is it benefits you. It's good for you to have a loving marriage. And the fourth reason, which didn't apply to this couple, but for most marriages, or not, the average marriage, I should say, is that it's good for your children. Not all couples will have this, but ultimately having a loving marriage is important for the children as well. During that study, we got to the part where it's good for your spouse, and Genesis chapter 2 came up. Actually, Genesis 2 came up in the first part as well. It glorifies God. But it wasn't until we got to the second part of the study that I saw something in Genesis 2, verse 18 that I'd never seen before. Turn back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. I'd seen it before, as we all have seen it before, but I'd never noticed it before. We've all had those moments where we see something 1,000 times, and all of a sudden we see something new that 1,000th and first time, and suddenly it goes, wow. It is not good for man to be alone. I'll make him a helper suitable for him. Why did God make woman in the first place? Because man was alone. It's not good for man to be alone. Why did God march all the animals in front of Adam? So he could name them? No. So Adam could see they were not suitable companions for him. The reason God made woman is because it was not good for man to be alone. We have people in our time who want to be alone. All they want is to be alone. We used to call them hermits. But some people, they want to go off in the wilderness of Alaska and be alone. They want to go off in the Andes and they just want to be alone. Those are people who usually, I really don't want to get into that. But God designed us to be around other people. He made man, showed man that all these animals were not going to be adequate companions for him. And God said, I'm going to make you a helper suitable for you. Usually in studies in marriage, we get focused on the idea of the wife being a helper. But we forget the idea that the reason God made her in the first place is so that man would not be alone. Today I want to share with you some of the things that I've happened across during the study and shared with that couple in the study about loneliness in marriage, how to prevent it, and how to fix it. Starting in Genesis 2, verse 18, first of all, it's not good for man to be alone. It's not good. Now think about this. Who did God make first? The man. Man was alone. Then came woman. Could the woman have been alone with the man there? Sure. Look at the picture. It happens every day. We're right next to somebody, and we're alone. And we feel that emptiness, that loneliness, that void. And we think of the ideas of neglect. We think of the ideas of frustration that lead to, what's the other one? There's another idea associated with neglect. I can't think of the word now. But we forget that neglect is a result of or leads to loneliness. When we feel neglected, we're really feeling lonely. When we feel like our needs, our wants are not being met by the other, we're feeling lonely. Resentment, that was the idea I was looking for. The resentment can come from that neglect. That's all a result of loneliness. Loneliness is the root of those things, not neglect. They are the symptoms of loneliness, the emotions of them, rather. So God made him a helper suitable to him. That's the New American Standard. The King James uses the word meet. And I always never thought to look up what the word meet was there, help meet. But turns out in ancient English, the word meet means proper fitting. That's why the King James used that word, because in ancient English, that's what the word means. It means suitable, a proper fit, like a square peg in a round hole. That's not meet. That's immeet, unmeet. You want a square hole for a square peg. The New King James uses the word comparable, a helper comparable to him. And other translations use the ideas of fit or like. In our culture, we live in a post-Renaissance, very romantic, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty kind of era, where love is the root of all things. How many times in the Bible did a woman agree to marry a man sight unseen? And a man agree to marry a woman sight unseen? It was fairly common. And it's still fairly common in some parts of the world. Not all people marry for love. Is it preferred? I would think so. But of course, I was raised in the post-Renaissance Cinderella Sleeping Beauty type of culture. I wasn't raised in a culture where you marry for practical reasons, where you marry for other reasons other than love. So many of our romantic movies and stories are centered around someone, a woman in particular, shunning. My wife was watching Titanic last night. She shunned the man she was supposed to marry, a rich, wealthy, rich, good-looking man for this poor kid. It's so romantic. She married for love. That's all fine and good. And it's probably a good thing to marry for love. But can we become suitable to one another? Can we become comparable? Can we become proper fitting? In studying the Scriptures, the scriptural examples, and studying other cultures and how they practice marriage, it seems that even people who seem like they should not be married or have anything in common can become a suitable or comparable or a proper fitting companion or mate for the other. Consider the story of Abigail and Nabal. Nabal was certainly not a suitable husband for Abigail. I can't remember the 1 Samuel, I know that. I wasn't planning on getting to this story, so sorry about that. Abigail and Nabal, somewhere in 1 Samuel. Nabal was a wicked man, and here it is, 1 Samuel 25. 1 Samuel 25. Abigail, in interceding for her Nabal's household, she says his name is Nabal, for in fact he is a wicked man. Apparently that's what his name meant. And she intercedes for him and for his household. And we forget sometimes that Abigail may have been kind of interceding for herself as well, because we don't really know. Abigail sure didn't know. Was his entire household going to suffer David's wrath along with Nabal? She was suitable for Nabal in that she had a better idea of what it meant to be a good spouse to her husband than apparently he had toward her. What I'm ultimately getting at is, this is my opinion. So everyone just pay attention to that. It's my opinion. It is my opinion that God made man and woman. We learn to be suitable to each other, regardless of how we come to be husband and wife, regardless of what happens in our marriage to separate us, to make us lonely. We can become suitable so that we are no longer lonely. Look at Ephesians chapter 5 and consider some of the things that Paul writes about in Ephesians 5. He starts off by saying, in Ephesians 5, starting in verse 22, "Wives, be subject to your own husbands as the Lord." Now, how does that make a wife suitable to her husband? Well, God designed marriage, and God created it, and at some point made the wife to be in subject to her husband. But he says in verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. It's a popular idea in modern, quote unquote, there's that air quotes thing, Christianity. Come to Jesus as you are, he'll accept you. Sure, that's true, but on his terms. We can't come to Christ and expect he'll take us any old way we want him to take us. It doesn't work that way. That's like forcing ourselves upon Christ. No. He takes us if we submit to him. We must make ourselves suitable to him, to his righteousness, so that we will be acceptable to him. Now, here we have the opposite side as well. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. It sure looks like to me that the husband has a major role in his wife being suitable to him, which also means that in loving her, he must make himself suitable to her. Would Christ have been a Savior of the body if he himself was not a suitable husband in the eyes of God? No. Christ had to maintain his purity. He had to maintain his love for his future bride in order to present himself first as a suitable mate to her. Why do we love Christ? John says, because he first loved us. The same is true of husband and wife. Husbands, we must make ourselves suitable to our wives. And let's not forget the part there in verse 25, that Christ gave himself up for her. What did Christ give up of himself for us? He left his equality with the Father in heaven to live as one of us. Now, even though Paul tells us that Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, that was a big deal. God left equality with God and made himself a bondservant. He did it willingly. He gave up part of himself for his bride. Part of growing together to become one flesh is each giving up parts of ourselves, the parts that we want to hold on to, for the benefit of our spouse. Why can't I do fill in the blank? Whatever blank you want, doesn't matter. Why can't I do that anymore? Well, it's not good for your spouse, which was the second reason on the list of reasons it's good to have a loving marriage. It's good for your spouse to have a loving marriage. If it's not good for your spouse, husband or wife, to fill in the blank, then we need to give that up. Well, why can't he or she just accept that about me? Why is it so important to you you hold on to that? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Isn't that what Scripture says? And of all people that's our neighbor, our spouse is our closest, or is supposed to be. No one else in the world are we become one flesh with other than our spouse. So we love our spouse not as we want to be loved, but as our spouse needs and wants to be loved, to be respected, and all the other things that go along with that. 1 Peter chapter 3, another place where Paul really comes back to making ourselves suitable for the other one. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 1. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, to your own husband. That's a benefit to your husband, isn't it? And for yourself, so that even, now here's where we really get to the benefit of the other one. So that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won. Not will be, may be won. How? Without a word, by the behavior of their wives. Ephesians 5 really looks like the man is to be taking a leadership role in the establishing of a suitable marriage and loving marriage. But here it really looks as if the wife has a major hand in that. How? By having acceptable behavior before God. Look at verse 2. Chaste and respectable or respectful behavior. Chaste and respectful. That was Abigail. He was won. He was spared in a way by the chaste and respectful behavior of his wife. Ultimately, his own behavior did him in, though, didn't it? Sure did. He could have been won when he had heard, oh, you went to David and you were chaste and respectful to him and spared me and my household and all my stuff. You need to be celebrated for that. And what did he do? He went off and celebrated his own self. And he ended up dying because of that. He could have been won, but he wasn't. A good and wise husband will see the behavior of his wife and may be won due to her example. So we have verse 3 through 5. Your adornment must not merely, and the New American Standard adds the word merely, because that seems to be the teaching here. It's not that women can't adorn themselves with braiding hair and jewelry and putting on dresses, but let that not be the only beauty that you have. Let that not even be the first beauty that you have, braiding of hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but let it, the primary beauty you have, be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children, if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear, making yourself a wife suitable to the needs of your husband. As we saw in Ephesians 5, the husband making himself suitable to the needs of his wife. I said it backwards. Here we have in 1 Peter, the wife making herself suitable to the needs of her husband. In Ephesians 5, the husband, the primary focus there, making himself suitable to the needs of his wife. Why? To become one flesh. Why? Because it is not good for a man or a woman to be alone. The two become one flesh. And then verse 7. You husbands in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. Why? Because it's good for her. A husband who lives with his wife in an understanding way is not harsh toward her, is not insensitive to her and her needs in any way, shape, or form. And that makes him suitable to her, as we've been reading about her making herself suitable to him. As with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so your prayers will not be hindered. Preachers especially sometimes forget our responsibilities to our families. We focus sometimes so much on studying with others that we forget we still need to study with our own families. It honors our wives. It honors our children if we remember that they are part of our lives first and foremost. What good does it do others if I lose my own soul and, oh, by the way, lose the soul of my wife and my children? God's going to hold us accountable for that, dads, husbands. Future dads and husbands will hold you accountable for the salvation, the souls of your own children and wives whom God has placed in your charge. And all of that, looking forward to inheritance. Show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. But Jesus said in heaven will not be married or given in marriage. Yeah, but wouldn't you like to see your spouse there too? You may not. How that's going to work? Are you still going to be married? Like, does that continue? I don't know. What if it does? What if it does? You get to stand before God. Hey, where's your wife? Isn't she right behind me? Nope. You lost that. You had a hand in that. Wife, same response. Where's your husband? Wasn't he in front of me? Nope. Your behavior was not excellent before me, so he could not be one. Do you want to hear those words? I sure don't want to hear the words of God to me. Where's your wife? Where's your children? Aren't they behind me? Nope. You did not do what you were supposed to do in taking care of them, to lead them here with you. I don't want to finish those two sentences because they're scary. All right, next. 1 Corinthians 7. 1 Corinthians 7. The passage we typically go to in regards to the sexual relationship, however, these principles apply to the rest of our relationships as well, husbands and wives, and future husbands. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Let's stop there for a second. In verse 3. Fulfill your duty to your wife. Fulfill your duty to your husband. In all things. We have responsibilities, obligations. In our post-Renaissance, love-focused, misunderstanding 1 Corinthians 13 culture, when we take our husbands and our wives, we make promises as tradition dictates. Honor, cherish, love, all the other things. We are taking on responsibility, obligation. We have duties to fulfill to our spouses. Husbands to your wives, our wives, and wives to your husbands. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. We must fulfill them. And if we do not, well, we'll get to that. Because we don't have authority over our own bodies. Now think about what we talked about in the last section regarding giving up of ourselves for the benefit of the other. Holding on to things in our personalities, holding on to things in our character, holding on to things in our habits and practices. Why? Because I like fill in the blank. I like being this way. Why should I change for her? I've been this way for however many decades or years or whatever. Why should I change for her? Well, according to Paul, you don't have authority over yourself. Your spouse does. The spouse has asked you to change something about yourself. Needs something to either stop or begin. You don't have authority to hold on to whatever it is you're holding on to, or not beginning a new practice that your spouse wants of you. That's not your option. It is your spouse's. What if it's wrong? Wrong before who? Well, wrong in my own opinion. Well, that's your opinion. You need to talk with your spouse about that and the ideas of opinions. But what if it's wrong before God? That's a whole different matter, isn't it? We can't violate God's laws for the sake of our spouses. We all know that. We're talking about the things that matter to our spouses alone. And that God has said, that's between you two. You two need to work that out to become one flesh. We don't have, and you future husbands, when you get married, you do not have authority over yourself any longer. Your spouse does. In how you treat your spouse, and how you treat her, and how she needs to be loved by you. Now, there are certainly this idea of submission and authority and those things that we're not talking about today. That's a different study. I'm not talking about that today. We're talking about obligations to your spouses that your spouse needs and wants from you that you have no reason to not fulfill other than you're a selfish jerk. Or you just haven't known better. What if your spouse hasn't communicated that to you properly? I didn't know you needed that from me. How do you not know? I've been doing this all this time, but you didn't tell me the words. I can't read your mind. Wives can say that to husbands as well. Sometimes husbands do the same thing that we say our wives do to us. We do things expecting our wives to figure it out. It doesn't work that way all the time. Sometimes we can figure it out, but sometimes we can't, both husbands and wives. We need to stop depriving each other, as Paul says. Stop depriving each other of what? Of the affection, of the love, of the respect, and of the honor due. This word is interesting. This word deprive in the New American Standard. in verse 5. It can be several ideas. It can be defraud. How can a husband and wife defraud each other in not giving each other what is due? Well, there's promises made. There's promises made. And when a promise is made and you withhold what you've promised, you are defrauding. You're going back on your word. You are, in a way, lying or robbing because you're taking and not giving. There's that example as well. You expect your spouse to do everything and you do nothing for your spouse. There's that. Then there is withholding. We all understand the idea of withholding certain affections in the sexual relationship in husband and wife, but there's also the withholding of respect, honor, love, cherishing, due the other one. That the other one has told you or has shown you that they need, that they want, but you are intentionally withholding it. Why? We've already talked about those reasons. Selfish jerk, or not knowing better, or not caring to know better. Then there is withdrawing. Perhaps you were this for a while. Perhaps you did show love for a while. Newlyweds, all that newlywed thing, right? What do they call that? Oh, what's that word? It's been so long since I was a newlywed. That first year or two when you're just newlyweds and everything's grand.
Oh, the honeymoon.
Honeymoon, the honeymoon thing. Honeymoon phase. And then, as time goes on, you start to learn more and more about the things that annoy you from your spouse. And as a way of revenge, we start withdrawing and we start detaching from the other one, which brings about loneliness. And instead of growing into one flesh and communicating and learning, what can I do to love my spouse? And asking the question, what do you need from me? What do I need to give up for your sake? What do I need to add for your sake? We withdraw and detach, and we don't become one flesh, and we become lonely. Then there's this idea of refusing payment of debt. There's that obligation thing again. Or refusing to give up or give in. All these ideas are the same. All these ideas are this one Greek word that the New American Standard says, deprive. I can't remember, does the King James say defraud in verse 5? Defraud. All those are appropriate ideas, and some translations will say defraud, some deprive. I can't remember what the other ones would say. And all of this is to talk about loneliness. Preventing loneliness. When God gave woman to man so that man would not be alone. And so that woman would not be alone. Why did God make man first? It was not good for man to be alone. So that when woman came along, she would not be alone. What God joins together, let not man separate, but let us grow together as spouses, giving up what needs to be given up for the sake of the other one to glorify God, so that loneliness is prevented, so that resentment is prevented, and so that we become one flesh before God, and He is honored and glorified in our marriages. There's a passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 4 that I just happened across preparing for that Bible study a couple months ago. And I don't remember how I came across it. It was probably a word search thing. But in Ecclesiastes 4, Solomon talks about the benefit of companions. Ecclesiastes 4, starting in verse 9. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls where there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. I know I've seen this passage before, but I don't think I ever saw it in the context of marriage before. 2 are better than 1. It is not good for man to be alone. A husband and wife that are one, that are united, that are one flesh, glorify God and are good for one another. A husband who does not feel alone in his life can do all kinds of amazing stuff. A wife that does not feel alone in her life can do all kinds of amazing stuff. Look at Proverbs 31 and the husband and wife that are described there. Neither of them are lonely. They are one, and yet each of them have their own responsibilities in life, and each of them trusts the other because they are one flesh. They fulfill their duties to one another. They have given up selfishness for the sake of the other one, for the sake of their marriage, and for the sake of God and His holy name, and glorify Him in their marriage. Look especially at verse 10. If either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Do husband and wife always experience the same trauma of life at the same time? No. One's parent dies and the other ones are not. Certainly, the other spouse will feel some, at least should be able to, feel some grief or remorse for that loss of their spouse's parent if they are close. That's ideal. But who's going to feel that effect more? The one whose parent that spouse was. So if the husband's mom dies, the husband's going to feel that more than the wife will, typically. So what is the wife's responsibility to her husband? To be there for her husband as a rock of support, as a it's okay, honey, to lift him up when he's feeling low. The same is true for the wife if her spouse or parent or sibling or something else happens. To be there for one another. What is the promise that is made in our marriage ceremonies now? In good times and in bad, through sickness and in health? Right? To be there for one another, regardless of the circumstance. And then verse 12. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. Now, some might think, oh, see, now you have polygamy. No. The point is not polygamy. The point is that one by itself is weaker. Imagine a husband and a wife, both striving together to become one flesh. The two become one, but they are also in a way 3, because they are stronger together than they are apart. And then there is the God factor in that. God can be that third part of that cord, can't He? Yes. If they are both striving to serve Him as they should. I've said more about that than I intended to say today, because sometimes that happens in certain passages as we go through them. And anyway, this has been on my mind for some time now, and I didn't want to put it off anymore. I wanted to get that out there for us, for all of our benefits, all of our marriage's benefits, so that we can all do a better job of becoming one flesh with our spouses. Myself as well, to give up things that I may be holding on to, and for all of you as well. We're going to turn the time back over to Eric now, who's going to lead us in song and prepare us for the Lord's Supper.